My daughter-in-law, she looked me dead in the eye and said, "There's no money, Olia. You stay home." And you know what? I just smiled and said, "All right, dear." But here's the thing. By the time their taxi even pulled up to the port, I was already on the owner's deck, sipping a hot coffee, watching the whole show.
So yeah, I bet you're wondering how in the world we got to that point. It all started a few weeks before, right in my own kitchen. It began with the smell of onions simmering on the stove and a quiet, nasty little betrayal that was disguised as an act of love.
You see, about 10 years ago, after my husband passed on, I signed everything over to my son, Tavarius. Everything. I told him, "Son, you're the head of this family now." I really wanted him to grow eagle's wings, you know? But instead, he just grew a bigger and bigger appetite for whatever his wife Kenyatta demanded.
I was living out back in the carriage house, just trying my best to stay out of the way, to be invisible. And then one afternoon, Tavarius and Kenyatta come rushing in, their faces all twisted up with a kind of panic I hadn't seen in years. Kenyatta, she's always been dramatic, announced that they had a crisis.
A leak in the roof of the main house, they said. Oh, it was a whole story. Black mold, rotted beams, the works. They needed $15,000 cash for urgent repairs. Otherwise, they said my house, the very house I built with my own two hands, was going to start to rot away. That was pretty much every penny I had left in my burial fund. But their family, of course I gave it to them.
That was the punch I knew was coming. Kenyatta delivered the news, her voice just dripping with fake sorrow, telling me how their nerves were completely shot from all the stress. But while she's spinning this whole yarn, her sleeve slides down just a little, and I saw it, a brand new, sparkling diamond tennis bracelet. That little thing cost at least 3 times what the repairs were supposed to. But the real proof, well, that wasn't on her wrist. It was waiting for me right in the trash can.
Later that night, I just went about my business. Washed the dishes, wiped down the table. Around midnight, I took the trash out to the big bins by the main gate, like I always do. Just then, the wind kicked up, and this little, crumpled ball of paper rolled right across the pavement and stopped at my feet. A simple thing, really. But that simple thing changed everything.
I picked it up and smoothed it out under the streetlight. And there it was, my money, $15,000. The invoice wasn't from some roofer. Nope, it was from Apex Voyages for the Grand Owner's Suite on a luxury cruise ship called the Gilded Magnolia. They weren't fixing a roof, they were buying themselves a fancy vacation. And right then and there, this icy cold flame just ignited deep inside me.
They forgot. They forgot that the name St. James used to carry some serious weight in the trucking and logistics world. They forgot who I was before I became just a grandmother in an apron. So I went back inside, pulled out my old leather agenda from under a stack of linens, and I dialed a number I hadn't called in 12 long years. It was time to remind them. It was time to remind them exactly who I was.
Let me tell you, the next 48 hours were a blur of cold, calculated efficiency. While they were running around yelling at each other about suitcases and what to pack, I was locked in my bathroom, waging a war over the phone. My old attorney, Solomon, he just chuckled when I told him what was going on. Ophelia, he said, you always did know how to play the long game. We got the papers drawn up, transferred operational control. That's right, I was taking my ship back. Oh, their departure was pure chaos. Kenyatta was screaming. Tavarius was running around looking like a deer in the headlights. They peeled out of the driveway with tires screeching, leaving me standing on the porch. 30 minutes later, a sleek, black, stretched sedan pulled right up to my date. A chauffeur got out and opened my door. The boss was ready to go. When we got to the port, I saw them, maybe 50 yards away, stuck behind a chain-link fence, just sweating and bickering in this massive line of people waiting to board. They looked absolutely pathetic. My driver, on the other hand, didn't even slow down. He drove right onto the wharf, straight to a private gangway. My war wasn't over. Oh no, it had just moved to a brand new battlefield.
So I settled into my suite, the owner's suite, and from a big security monitor on the wall, I watched them finally get into their cabin, the diamond suite, the one my money paid for. I saw them pop a bottle of champagne, toasting to their so-called freedom.
The audio feed was crystal clear. I heard everything. I heard them mimicking my voice, laughing about how gullible I was. Kenyatta, she called me an old heifer. I just sat there, watching them, sipping my coffee. I didn't feel hurt. I just felt disgust. It was time for phase 2.
I made one phone call. That's all it took. When they came back to their suite after yelling at some poor bartender, their keycards just blinked red. Access denied. A steward very coolly informed them of an administrative error and their reassignment. Turns out their luggage had already been moved down to stateroom 0012 on the lowest deck with no windows right next to the engine block.
Well, they stormed up to the VIP sun deck, ready to just tear the place apart. And there I was, just sitting in a soft armchair, enjoying the sunset. My son's face went from shock to just pure, ugly rage as he started screaming at me. Then Kenyatta lunged, her nails out like claws, trying to grab me.
Before she could even lay a finger on me, a voice like a ship's horn just boomed across the deck. Captain Thaddeus Emmerich. He stepped out from the bridge, looking like a cliff face in his dress uniform. He just stood right between us, and his shadow completely covered Kenyatta.
The captain, well, he enlightened them. I wasn't just some guest. I held the controlling interest in a company called Riverflow Holdings. I owned the shipping company, I owned the port, and I owned this riverboat, from the keel all the way to the smokestack. They weren't on vacation. They were just uninvited guests in my living room. And that's when their knees finally hit the deck. But I was not done with them, not by a long shot. That evening, I had them invited to a private dining room. I'm sure they showed up hoping for forgiveness, thinking they could talk their way out of it. They looked like two little school children being called into the principal's office. But when they sat down, the table in front of them was completely empty.
I just pushed a simple gray folder across the table. It wasn't a menu. It was a forensic accounting audit of the last 5 years they'd been living on my dime. The ridiculously inflated pharmacy bills that actually paid for Kenyatta's manicures, the $1,000 weekly grocery write-offs, even them using my pension card to pay for gas, and of course, the $15,000 roof that was never, ever repaired.
I laid it all out for them. Nice and simple. I wasn't senile, I was just patient. I was holding out hope that their conscience would eventually kick in, but my patience ran out the second I found that invoice in the trash. I told them that as of an hour ago, they were cut off. Completely. They had nothing, not enough to even buy a bottle of water. They had one last desperate card to play, though. Their last-ditch effort was to have me declared incompetent. They actually dragged the ship's doctor to my room, screaming that I had dementia, that I was having delusions of grandeur. It was their all-in bet. But the doctor, he just smiled at me. "Good afternoon, Madam St. James," he said. "How's that blood pressure of yours today?" Turns out, Dr. Beauchamp has been my personal physician for the last 22 years. The very next day, the ship stopped. This wasn't a scheduled port of call. It was a desolate, empty pier in the middle of rural Arkansas. When Tavorius and Kenyatta were escorted off the ship, they saw their 4 huge, fancy suitcases just sitting there, waiting for them on the cracked concrete. I stood on the deck looking down at them, and I called out, "Kenyatta, you told me there's no money, you stay home. Well, now you have no money, and you can't afford this journey." And with that, the gangway was raised, the engines roared to life, and the gilded Magnolia pulled away, leaving them standing on a wind-swept pier with a pile of useless junk. As their angry shouts faded away behind us, I turned to Captain Emmerich. The schedule said we were headed to New Orleans. I told him, to hell with the schedule. Plot a course north, to Minnesota. I'd always dreamed of seeing the fall foliage on the upper Mississippi, and for the first time in years, I actually laughed. A real, loud, pure laugh of freedom. I had my ship, I had my money, and I had a whole river of time stretching out in front of me.